Turns out there were British citizens who were captured and sold as slaves in Mogadishu in the early 19th century. And one Somali decided to buy them and release them from slavery. And that's a story we get from reading the book that I'm reading at the moment, The Somali and Their Lands. It's a collection of articles that were written between 1830 and 1890. I took very interesting articles that were published by the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society of London. Now, there is also a mention of the capture and maybe the destroying of a ship that were fighting Napoleon Bonaparte. This is very late in the 18th century. Very interesting stuff. Now, the article I'm reading is the first article actually of the book, and this is an article that was written by one Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher. Now, Christopher came to the east coast of Africa with a ship that was called the East India Company brig of war Tigris. It was a huge ship, could carry up to 70 people. Of course, by the standards of that time, it was a very huge ship. And he comes to the east coast of Africa, goes to Zanzibar, Mombasa, and he describes that journey towards the north. And now the place I'm going to read is where he tells us about arriving at Brava. The article itself is titled Extract from a Journal by Lieutenant W. Christopher, commanding the HC brig of war Tigris on the east coast of Africa. And it is dated 8th May 1843. It's sort of a diary though. It's not just that day. It's going to give us different dates. He indicates a date and then he tells us what happened on that date. Now let's read and see what he writes about his visit to Brava. He writes, in the evening landed at the town in an armed boat to call on the chief and deliver the letter of Imam Said of Zanzibar, together with the letter relative to the wreck of Bugalo having British property on board, which was very urgently wanted at Zanzibar. There was another ship that had wrecked, and seems like he had been given a letter from Zanzibar to bring to the chiefs of Brava and make inquiries about that ship. Now, there is something he mentions about this letter from Imam Said of Zanzibar. It was a letter that was meant to introduce him to the people he was going to encounter. But it does mention that in many places that letter did not really serve him as he was expecting, which of course tells you that the Sultan of Zanzibar was not that much like a power in that region as some documents would like you to believe, because he says sometimes we present the letter and the people did not really take it seriously, but sometimes it helped. Then he continues, I was received in a warm, friendly manner to my surprise and conducted to the best looking house in the place by a Somali chief named Haji Awisa, who carried in his hand a highly ornamented sword, which I was afterwards informed was sent to him by Said. So he reaches there, introduces himself, and then he's taken to this beautiful, nice house where he was going to stay. I had not been seated many minutes before a man of very unpromising appearance with large features and a dead yellow eye, his unusual height somewhat lessened by an ugly stoop, came towards me holding some papers in his hand, which after the usual compliments and inquiries and seating himself, he unceremoniously presented for perusal. So he has arrived at Brava. He has been welcomed by this chief. He calls him chief. I don't know whether that is the title that he used to go by. Probably not. And he's taken to this house and he sits down. And then there's this tall guy who comes, maybe sits next to him, and then they exchange, of course, greetings. And then he hands over to him these papers that he needed him to look at. Very interesting event there, actually. And these papers have some meaning. He continues, these papers were very important documents for a stranger intent on examining the country in the neighborhood and gaining information. The first was giving the bearer a high character for honesty and a fair dealing as a broker or agent for purchasing cargoes, hides principally, and ivory. The next was a statement written by a hooponer of an English whaleboat, acknowledging the great kindness and attention shown him by the bearer. So these documents that are presented to him, he says they were of two kinds. There is the one that he was given that tells of the person who carried them, of the person he was. I would say it was a recommendation letter, basically. And it, of course, tells the person that it is presented to, that the person who has this letter is a reliable person, an honest person. And this goes into the traditional arrangement in the Somali society when it came to doing business. When you came as an outsider, you could not just do business with anybody the way you wanted. You needed to have a middle person, and once you interact with that person the very first time and you have an understanding, that person was going to do whatever business you needed to do on your behalf, maybe sell and buy. That is very well explained or described by Ibn Battuta in his book when he traveled to Mogadishu. So this is what was happening in this case, even though this guy Christopher was not coming to do business, but seems like by this time there was this general understanding that if you came, you wanted to travel around, you needed to have somebody to take you around. So this person who is presenting these papers it goes by the name Dera, and Dera is going to tell him a story about these guys who were captured in Mogadishu and became slaves. He continued, the opener, having with 5 others, when chasing a whale, unfortunately lost his ship and making for the nearest land, reached it and about 60 miles north of Mogadishu in 9 days. Two of his champions had died from exhaustion, and the officer expiring shortly after reaching the shore. He and the survivors were brought down to Makutsha by the natives, and I fancy sold as slaves unknown to themselves. So Makutsha is a name he writes about Mogadishu, I think. Makutsha is Mogadishu, but he uses that Mogadishu and Makutsha. I don't know whether it's a translation thing later on. It's not very clear, but I left it there the way it is because maybe there is a way that it could be understood by other people. So this gentleman who writes the letter says that they wrecked in the sea and then they came on to the shore. They walked and then they were captured, brought to Mogadishu and sold as slaves. Dera said he rescued them from the people of Makuchu for 30 German crowns. Now, that German crowns, I went to do some research. Turns out is the currency that was being used in Britain. Then it wasn't really called German crowns, but it was a nickname. Basically, they used to call the currency of Britain during that time. So Dera had to pay 30 of these coins to the people who had bought these British citizens as slaves, and he had to pay that so that he gets them. And probably paid more than the market price for slaves because maybe he intended to let these guys go, which probably true, as the statement says, they were badly off until they arrived at Brava. So he buys them and then he brings them to Brava and releases them. Now, these are not the only people who come into that show, of course. He's going to tell us about more of that kind of stuff happening. And then he writes, having passed the night in the open, sheltered somewhat by a hedge on the windward side, under which by my guide's forethought the heights had been spread, I returned to the ship in the morning. After partaking of breakfast or fall tea and milk obligingly provided by Dera, I asked him again to let me see his papers. So this is another day, I think 2 days later, when he brings up that issue of the documents again, and he tells him, let me have a look at the papers again. As I had imperfectly perused them by my lampside, they prove that Brava for 14 years has been a welcome port to European and American traders, several of whom have resided on shore for days at a time. So looking at these documents, turns out Brava, or Barawa as it's called today, used to be a city or a port city where people will come from all over the place, the Europeans, British in particular, and Americans, they will come to that part, and sometimes they will spend days in the city. And then he writes this, the chiefs, 7 in number, say that Captain Owen's visit reconciled them to the European intercourse. Now, there's another place where it describes, of course, the governance structure of Barawa or Brava. Brava was one of those city-states that were kind of like governed by a senate. It wasn't one individual. It was so they call them chiefs, but I might call them senators. Probably is the right terms for them. And they ruled as a council together. It wasn't one individual. And he talks of this Captain Owen. I went digging trying to find out who was this Captain Owen. Turns out Captain Owen was somebody who went by the name Admiral William Fritz William Owen, who was a captain of he was a senior officer in the East India Company. He was a senior officer during that time. He continues, the River Jube, which is River Juba or Gavind, which is interesting. Juba River had another name, Gavind, is under the authority of the Sheikhs of Brava, who, on being closely questioned by me, mentioned every particular of the murder of the 7 belonging to the frigates Leopard and Deodalas. Now, the frigates Leopard and Deodalas, these were 2 British ships, And these ships are very interesting ships when it comes to the history of the Horn of Africa, and in fact, the history of Britain and France. There was a time when Napoleon, this is very late in the 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte is at the war with the British, and Napoleon Bonaparte comes to Egypt and conquers Egypt, or takes over Egypt, not really conquering, takes over Egypt. The British were the ones who were kind of like around that region, they were like the power then. And then the British are struggling. The British send out two ships from the south. These are the ships that is mentioning. And these ships were coming to block Napoleon Bonaparte from traveling all the way to India to disturb, of course, the British Empire. And something happened to these ships. Looks like they wrecked. At least one of them wrecked, and the guys survived, but for some reason they were killed by the Somalis at the coast. I think that's what he's talking about here. Their statement perfectly agreed with an account I had obtained from an old fisherman 2 days previously. So this story of the Leopard and Daedalus, these ships that were sent during the expedition to the Red Sea, during the disturbance between the British and Napoleon Bonaparte. He says he was told this story by a fisherman also. The chiefs basically confirmed it. He continues, as the principal men were present, besides changing assembly of about 30 others, I determined on the spur of the moment, influenced by the candor of the people, to offer repayment to Dera of the 30 German crowns which he had remitted to Makutshu, which is Mogadishu, to rescue from slavery those of the crew of the English whaleboat who kid escaped being killed. I don't know, maybe that's a typo. Kid, there could be a typo. So this Christopher guy, Lieutenant Christopher, decides he's going to pay Dera the money that he paid to buy the British guys who had been bought or sold as slaves, and then he released them. So he decides, I'm going to pay you back your money. He writes, the offer was accepted in silence, and I trust it will leave a very beneficial effect. So he thinks by paying and the offer being accepted, it was going to, of course, create a good relationship between the British and the Somalis. He says, I at the same time gave a written document stating the reasons why I had given the money, and I reminded the chiefs that any expense sustained for a similar purpose will meet a return, but that it will be better to procure in any similar is a writing under the band of the sufferers. So he tells the rulers of Brava that I'm paying this amount of money, and if you ever incur a similar expense sometime later, maybe some other British guys are captured and sold as slaves, you can buy them, and if you just have them write a letter and then release them, and then when somebody like me comes around, we're going to pay you. Mentioning the amount that I had been paid on the account, I had asked why they did not procure writing in the present instance. Their reply to me was nobly thrilling. They were strangers and naked. Could we ask them for anything? So he asks them, why didn't you ask these guys to write something indicating that you had spent some money on their behalf? And they tell him, like, these were strangers, naked, horrible looking guys. Like, were we to ask them for anything really? We just decided to do it as mercy to them. This story kind of like ends here. It does not tell us how the guys left or where they went. Of course, we are going to continue reading this article. It's a very long article with very interesting insights and stories and pictures from the 1840s, pictures from the east coast of Africa along the Somali border today, or Somalia border today. So we are going to continue reading. Of course, as I said, this is from the book that I compiled. These are articles that were written between the year 1830 and 1880 or 1890. So you can check the link, go to Amazon, get yourself, could be a Kindle, a digital copy, or a physical copy if you prefer reading physical copies. Those are my random thoughts.